All right, can I have you state your full name and spell your last name for the record, please?
That's Curtis Jundt, Jundt.
And Mr. Jundt, were you in the room this morning when I went through the penalties for perjury?
I was.
And do you understand what perjury is?
Sure do.
And being advised of the potential penalties for perjury, do you promise to tell the truth in this case today?
So help me God.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Bakke.
Okay, Mr. Jundt, can you tell the commissioners a little bit about your educational background and work background?
Yes, so 41 years ago this month I graduated from NDSU with my engineering degree. And prior to that, for about 5 years, while going through school, I worked for 3 different consulting engineering firms out on construction inspection, putting in water lines and sewer lines across Fargo and in the Burleigh County, Bismarck area. But I left NDSU with my engineering degree, decided I did not want to be a consultant, so I did get a job, took me back to Bismarck, working for the MDU Resources Corporation, which I spent 15 years there. Much of it was in the pipeline business. I actually was the guy that you would go to if you wanted to build to or from the interstate pipeline. My last 3 or 4 years there, I was director of WBI Gas Services, and I oversaw the development of shallow gas fields, drilled about 118 shallow gas wells, fracked the dickens out of them, and built all the gathering systems and booster stations. I oversaw it. I was basically the project guy.
Do you come from an engineering family?
I sure do.
And who was your father?
Ray Jundt. He was city engineer of Bismarck for about 34 years until he retired in April of '93.
And have you been involved in terms of engineering and building energy pipelines before?
I have.
Okay. Have you been involved in building compressor stations for any energy pipelines?
As part of being more or less the project manager, I had a good team of engineers, but yes, the Glen Olin station injecting into the 42-inch Northern Border Pipeline, the extension from Valley City to Mapleton, which involved compression, but numerous projects.
Okay. And have you been involved in building and overseeing projects involving energy shutoff valves?
Of course, that's all part of the operation, maintenance, safety, control of a natural gas pipeline.
And you also have experience with operation of energy pipelines for gases other than CO2.
Natural gas, that's the world I come from, so very passionate about, so yes.
Okay. And you have experience dealing with safety issues relating to energy pipelines.
Yes, most of the 15 years of my corporate career, I was actually on the corporate safety committee representing the headquarters in Bismarck, and we would hold our meetings in Glendive. And I even did hazmat training. So safety, even in my private businesses that I retired from 7 years ago, I did have a safety services company. It's a very big part of my world.
Okay. And as part of your work experience with energy pipelines and also your engineering training, do you have knowledge and education and experience with carbon dioxide, with CO2?
I do not.
Okay. Do you know whether or not there's a difference between natural gas and CO2?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And what is the difference?
Well, I believe the differences are very stark. For one thing, they was just Chief Briggs talked about how natural gas goes up, and I know it's all about the thermal physical properties of natural gas versus CO2 and the laws of gravity. Methane, which is predominantly 96% of our natural gas stream with other hydrocarbons, that's about 0.55 to 0.65 specific gravity, and when that ruptures, it goes up until it dissipates in the air. You know, you could have a spark that could set it off, where CO2 is 1.55, so 1.55 times heavier than ambient air, and that will, once it sublimes from its solid particles and ice crystals, it will warm up and become a gas and move low to the ground. in low-lying areas. There's a very significant difference. CO2 is not combustible, but it moves across pretty good distances in low-lying areas like fog, and depending on the breeze, the temperature, increasing the density, and the colder it is, like this winter, we had days where it was 25 below zero and more, that cloud will stay dense and take longer to dissipate if we have 10 to 15 mile an hour winds, which we can get. Whereas natural gas is different. It goes up, and if it does ignite, we're talking about an event that is localized to where the rupture is. There's significant differences.
Okay. Let's talk about size and pressure of pipelines. And so you have studied the Summit pipeline application and their engineering information.
Just generally, only from what I've been able to grab online, I've not purchased a full application, but I've read enough material, listened to all the hearings that have been held and the testimony of Mr. Powell and others. So,
and so you've heard the testimony that there are different sizes of pipes at various points on the Summit pipeline?
Yes. Like any pipeline system, you've got your gathering lines, which I would call those the lines coming from the ethanol plants, or laterals, and then they move to maybe several will come into a trunk line, so you'll maybe have 4-inch, then you'll move to maybe a 6 or 8-inch, and it's all about volume until you finally interconnect with the main line. I want to call what is coming through Emmons and Burleigh County a main line. So we're at the end of the delivery system, so we have the largest pipe, the largest capacity, just by the fact that all of the inputs are happening in 4 other states, and one from ours.
And so you've heard that there are some pipelines on the Summit systems from the ethanol plants that are 8-inch pipelines, is that correct?
And 4-inch, 4, 6, and 8, I believe, yeah.
So what's the difference going to be in terms of the volume of CO2 that will be in a 4-inch pipeline on the Summit pipeline system versus the 24-inch main line, as you call it, through Emmons County and Burleigh County?
So early on, as my awareness, I gained an awareness about this project, that was a question that was asked of me almost right away. What's the difference between an 8-inch, we're talking about Denbury running from DGC up to the Weyburn Field is 8 and 12. What's the difference between that 8-inch and a 24-inch? Is this 24-inch going to carry 3 times more? And I said, no, just the difference of squares. Without friction losses, this 24-inch will be equivalent to 9.4 8-inch pipes, but when you factor in friction loss, you're talking about 15 8-inch pipes to move about the same volume as this one will at 2183 PSI. It's significantly different.
Okay. And so you would need 15 8-inch pipelines to carry the same amount of CO2 that can be carried in the 24-inch pipeline?
That's my opinion, yes.
Okay. And then what significance does it have that this pipeline is planned to be a critical pressure pipeline at 2,183 pounds per square inch?
So I'm very familiar with high-pressure pipelines. To reach supercritical phase, CO2 has to reach 1,070 psi at 87 degrees. Now, there are going to be points along this pipeline where the temperature is probably not going to be 87 degrees the further the CO2 gets away from the discharge end of a compressor station. So, it could be less than that, but when you're well above 1,070 psi, you're going to remain in supercritical phase across a pretty good temperature range.
So when this Summit pipeline is planned to be supercritical, is that extremely high pressure?
It is, near 2183 maximum allowable operating pressure. Starting out, depending on how full the pipe is, they may not be at that right away, but from what I've heard, they intend to, like any pipeline, you intend to maximize your throughput. So we have to expect sooner than later they will get it to be running this at 2183 PSI.
And we already heard today that there's been an additional ethanol plant added from South Dakota. That's going to add to the volume that's going to go into the pipeline, correct?
Well, that I wasn't aware of until now, but on their own website, press releases, February 2nd of this year, they added Devo. I don't know what Devo is, DEVO. It's a renewable jet fuel company. So what they're going to try to do is add any emissions from the burning of natural gas. Why is that? Because that's your purest CO2. You burn natural gas in pretty complete combustion, you're going to be at probably 98% CO2, and you're going to have some nitrogen maybe, and because it's pipeline quality gas that's being burned in all these ethanol plants, we don't allow hardly any H2S in our natural gas pipeline system. So that's not even going to be there, but you'll have some other trace contaminants in the other couple percent, but that's why they're pulling off of these ethanol plants.
Okay. And so will this be 24-inch CO2 pipeline that's planned for Emmons County and Burleigh County?
It is.
Okay. And so let's talk about that 24-inch pipeline. And from a shutdown standpoint, how that would happen if there was a leak, let's say, God forbid, in northeast of Bismarck in the 24-inch Summit pipeline. What would that shutdown process look like? Well,
Again, I can only relate from the natural gas industry, and we are talking about a totally different, we're talking about a baboon and a monkey here, but this is a baboon, so if this thing's running at supercritical at maximum pressure, you don't get a lot of wiggle room in shutdown procedures. If you're running a natural gas pipeline at 400 PSI, but the allowable pressure in the pipe is 800, you can probably shut your valves quicker because, you know, you have 400 PSI to pressure up. So this, in my opinion, will have to be an orderly shutdown to prevent a water hammer-like effect and catastrophic failure downstream of any rupture. So the upstream valve could shut pretty darn quick, like immediately. Again, I'm just envisioning, but I don't believe, as I've heard from Mr. Powell, the valve can shut and the actuator can close the valve in 2 minutes. I don't believe that that's going to be 2 minutes from the time they sense a pressure drop. There's going to be an orderly shutdown, and I know there's pressure sensors and pop-offs on all their compressor stations and all the safety stuff. But there's going to be, I don't know, is it going to be tens of minutes? Is it going to be 30 minutes before that downstream valve is shut? I don't believe it's going to be just minutes.
And so what is this did you call it a water hammer effect?
Correct.
Okay, what's the water hammer effect?
Well, you know, you're running this at a supercritical fluid, and it's really not the pure fluid liquid CO2, and it's not the gas. It's right in between those two phases. It's very dense, weighing, you know, having a weight in the pipeline that, and you're going to be at 2183 PSI. It's going to be, you know, potentially 50 pounds per cubic foot in that pipe at 2100 PSI. And if it's running at maximum allowable pressure, I mean, the compressor station in Burleigh County, I believe there's one in Burleigh County, that would have to shut down immediately. So once that shuts down, then and stops discharging, they can shut the downstream valve of beyond the rupture. So maybe minutes is not unreasonable, depending on the response that their dispatch, their SCADA, you know, how much the pressure drops and what his response is. It's going to be up. There's going to be humans involved in this. The equipment's not going to automatically shut stuff down. There will be humans involved in evaluating the data.
Okay. So will there be a lag time between when Summit in Ames, Iowa sees a drop in pressure to when they can start the shutdown process?
I'm going to object on the grounds that this is speculation. This witness has testified that he's not operated and familiar with CO2 pipelines. He's speaking generally about operations of SCADA systems. So a question calling for this witness to provide that
I can rephrase.
as a fact is
I can rephrase. When you have a system, an energy pipeline system, is there a lag time between when there's a drop in pressure and when the system can be shut down?
Logically.
Hang on.
Sorry, Mr. Jundt. I'll renew the objection. Now we're calling all pipelines energy pipelines. If we're going to treat all pipelines the same, fine, but just calling them energy pipelines is a vague question.
I can ask about natural gas. Same question, natural gas.
Then I'm going to object on the grounds of relevance because now we have a witness whose history is in natural gas, a long history in natural gas. But now Mr. Baki's only going to ask him about what would happen if this were a natural gas pipeline.
Well, Summit's the one who said it's the same as a natural gas pipeline in terms of the safety aspects. That's what I'm asking about.
The specific questions he's asking about are the SCADA operations in the event of the SCADA operations in the event of an event on a natural gas pipeline. If he wants to rephrase the question and draw parallels, that's fine. But he specifically asked him about what's going to happen on a natural gas pipeline system.
Yeah, I can rephrase the question. When a natural gas pipeline system is being shut down, is there a lag time between when there's a drop in pressure and when the valves can be shut off to shut down the pipeline?
That was the exact same question. I've got the objection out there. I'm not going to keep interrupting. I know we are pressed for time.
Yep, the objection's noted, and yeah, I'm not sure on relevance either, but he can answer.
There's a lag time.
Okay. And what does that lag time range to and from?
I don't know. It depends on the circumstance. The amount of pressure drop, location. If it's a small pressure drop, it could be a faulty pressure sensor. They would send a field guy out to verify. So one size doesn't fit all in any of this. Okay. So.
In terms of pipeline, do you understand this is a carbon steel pipeline that Summit proposes to install? Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And is that type of carbon steel pipeline, CO2 pipeline, does it have the same susceptibility to corrosion that a natural gas pipeline does?
It does.
Okay, and so can you explain that?
So natural gas, we limit 4 pounds per million cubic foot of water. We let in minimal grains of H2S, 0.4% of CO2. CO2 and H2S are extremely corrosive, especially if there's any water vapor content in the pipeline at all. But the biggest thing with water content in the natural gas pipeline isn't, it's not when water vapor mixes with methane, CH4, it's not in and of itself corrosive. We minimize that for, yes, corrosion, but we minimize it so that when you do pressure drops across the system into town borders and across valve settings, that's an endothermic reaction. We don't have hydrates. So that's why we limit other liquid hydrocarbons too, to prevent valves and things like that from freezing up.
Okay. So is CO2 from carbon capture likely to have some water in it?
Well, that's one of the byproducts of natural gas combustion. That's another is water vapor, and they'll have to dehydrate after capture at every ethanol plant.
Okay. So if there's some water vapor in the CO2 that goes in the pipeline, will that increase the risk of corrosion of the pipeline?
Correct. Just like, they don't have to deal with H2S, which is a good thing, but they're going to have to be extremely vigilant, and I believe even more than natural gas, because of the fact that any water vapor, any water in that pipeline with CO2 forms that carbonic acid, and it can corrode through the pipe very quickly. They'll have to dehydrate this CO2, drier than a popcorn fart. I mean, it's going to have to be very, dry. And I'm sure that's what they're going to do, but that's another critical thing that has to be monitored, because that carbonic acid can do significant damage to even a weld. I mean, your weakest link are your welds. So the internal corrosion on the internal part of a weld is a big risk.
Do CO2 pipelines operate at higher pressure than natural gas pipelines?
Oh, not necessarily. I mean, in my experience, the highest pressure one I believe I've had any experience with is Northern Border, and that runs at 1440, and maybe higher. I think they did a pressure upgrade. It might be up to 18. It might be close to 2,000 by now, but that would be probably the highest one I'm aware of.
Summit says that a CO2 pipeline is safe or safer than natural gas pipelines. From an engineering perspective, do you believe that to be true?
Absolutely not.
Okay. And why not?
Well, Chief Briggs explained part of it, and I just explained a little bit of it here earlier. We're talking about a monkey and a baboon here. So I would prefer that the CO2 were combustible. I would prefer that it was the specific gravity of methane, or even anhydrous ammonia, which has a specific gravity of 0.767, I think, because it's going to tend to disperse upward and out much faster. You know, we have significant experience with natural gas. We odorize it. When they built the first long-haul 100-some-mile natural gas pipeline 130 years ago, they didn't odorize it. But, you know, like all things in engineering, pretty much, we learn and grow from, you know, catastrophic or bad incidences. So then that came into play years later, and we odorized natural gas. That's a significant safety aspect and a significant difference between CO2 and natural gas. We have something that you can smell even a very small leak anywhere around your home or in your home. And so 130 years of natural gas versus and 3 million miles of pipe in natural gas systems versus 5,150. I mean, we're talking two different animals here from a safety standpoint and public awareness.
And then in terms of anything that would alert someone there's been a CO2 leak, will there be any color, any odor, any plume that would show a color in the plume?
No. Not in this CO2, and Chief Briggs addressed that.
Yeah.
Hold on. Sorry, the ordering is I have to go first. This witness has now testified several times that his analogy is that we're talking monkeys and baboons, two things that are terribly different. He's testified that he has experience only with either the monkey or the baboon, whichever it is, or apples and oranges. I think he's being offered as some sort of expert witness, but who has now testified that he only has expertise in a different field. And so I don't know what the foundation is for continued questions about this application when he's disqualified himself as an expert by saying it's not the same topic.
Well, it's not the same type of gas, but it is a gas that
Correct.
you study and know the engineering of and the physical properties of. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so my
Mr. Bakke, I think you need to establish his experience with CO2. I mean, I think that's what the objection was, that his experience is on natural gas and not CO2.
And he established earlier, right out of the gates, that he has no experience in CO2. We didn't stop there. There's some leeway, but we do have time pressures, and we now have just general opining about CO2, and I think we're too far beyond what he ought to be allowed to testify to.
Well, I think what you were saying, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Jundt, is that in terms of CO2, you don't have experience building or operating a CO2 pipeline. Is that correct?
Right, I don't, even though it's similar type construction methods and pipe material and valves and things like that. I mean, it's just carrying a different product, but the construction methods, the pipe, the materials, compressor stations, valves, mainline block valves, MLBV, they're pretty much the same.
Okay. And so then in terms, and as part of the reason that there's not a lot of engineers that have experience with CO2 pipelines is there just aren't that many of them?
That's correct.
Okay. But you do have knowledge about CO2 and its properties and its propensities And on oil wells, there is CO2 that occurs. On pipelines, there's some CO2, is that correct?
There is, yep, we deal with that and H2S.
Okay, and so you've dealt with CO2 on the pipelines you've been involved with and with...
Yeah, making sure we limit what goes in, correct.
Sure, okay. So getting back to my question was, is there going to be any warning to the public or someone nearby in the event there's a CO2 leak in terms of odor or color or something like you might have with natural gas where you can smell a leak?
No, there won't be. You'll hear the jet noise like Chief Briggs talked about.
Okay. And so in terms of comparing gases, natural gas versus CO2, in terms of what would happen in the leak event, is one more lethal or potentially lethal than the other?
I believe CO2 is substantially more lethal.
I'm going to object. If he's going to start testifying about lethality, that's a whole nother field unto itself. We're now talking about lethality of CO2 by an experienced natural gas pipeline engineer. There's got to be a foundation established to have an expert
We've
discussion.
already got the exhibits that discuss from OSHA what the lethality is of CO2. Now I'm asking him to compare that to natural gas, which he's worked in for decades. So he knows the lethality of natural gas. Now I'm just asking him to compare with what the OSHA information is in terms of these exposure things that we've heard about.
There was no reference to any document right now in this question about OSHA comparisons. And I
guess you can ask him when it's your turn, what does he base that
Okay,
on?
hang on. If you're asking him to compare OSHA studies with natural gas, that's fine, but the OSHA information speaks for itself, and I tend to agree we're kind of getting in the weeds here, and we have a long list of testimony to get through, so I don't know that this is...
In all due respect, Your Honor, I think I should be allowed to confront their claim, which is their claim frequently, that this is no more dangerous than natural gas. This is someone who has expertise and substantial experience, decades with natural gas. So I don't...
Okay. But again, if you're asking him, he's said that, and he generally understands carbon dioxide, but now you're asking him to make a comparison on issues that I think is beyond what he has indicated as his expertise on that.
I don't think so. Can you speak to the
Yeah, I would like to, when your ninja lawyering stuff is done here, I'd like to have some input. I've had to deal with more than just methane. I mean, we've had to move ethane, pentane, butane, propane in our gas streams, and CO2. I know enough about the thermodynamics, the thermophysical properties, the laws of gravity, to know the difference. You don't have to be someone that was out there and did some, 3-mile test of an 8-inch pipeline and burst it or whatever. You can, understanding the thermophysical properties coming from the engineering world of gases, have a pretty good idea to envision what might happen. And that's one of the things I've taken exception to from the very beginning I got involved in this is significantly more safe than any pipeline running through Burleigh County. That is total BS. It is not. It is a very large high-pressure pipeline carrying a totally different product. I do have enough of a background. I didn't just fall off the turnip truck, so I do have enough of a background to know the difference between CO2, methane, pentane, hexane, butane, propane. They all have different thermophysical properties. So that's what I'm trying to address here.
Your Honor, I think the objection, though, is that the lethality. If Mr. Bakke is referring to Exhibit 166, that's the effects of hydrogen sulfide. So I'm not sure which OSHA report you're referring to, Mr. Bakke.
And I withdrew that question and moved on to another question. I think that's what he was responding to.
Okay.
But I can ask a different question. I think he's answered it. Based on the thermophysical properties of CO2, let's talk about what would happen if a leak occurred north of Bismarck, based on the thermophysical properties of CO2, what would happen if that leak occurred?
Okay, so this is where the plume modeling is going to be extremely complex, and it is extremely complex because of all the variables. But I can envision knowing enough about the thermophysical properties of natural gas versus propane, butane, and CO2 in a pure form, 98%, supercritical. When that erupts, it's going to be, well, the Satartia one was 1402 psi. If this one's at 2100 psi and it's a guillotine break, which Chairman Chrisman, we call that a guillotine break when the pipe separates at a weld, because you have the full diameter of the pipe venting at that point versus just a crack or a pinhole. So in a guillotine break in a 24-inch pipe, this is going to blow a crater in a hole. It's very substantial. The temperature will drop to minus 109 and colder. It'll shoot solid particles of CO2 up in the air. It'll crystallize any water vapor in the air. And when that finally warms up, it'll flow to the ground. This is not, this is exact science. This is why Commissioner Gehring had a point. And because of what this pipeline has brought to the attention of a lot of people, I've been on this soapbox for 30 years. There's no way CO2 makes it up to the ozone layer. That is not what thins the ozone. And I thank Commissioner Gehring for expressing what, I would have liked to have said. It moves to the ground, and that's what makes it very dangerous. And we had 101 inches of snow this year. We had stretches where we were 25, 30 below zero. I mean, operationally, checking on a valve, if you have a valve actuator failure, to get to it, you better have a UTV with snow tracks on it or you're not getting there. I mean, I can envision what's going to be needed to respond. And the further this pipeline is away from occupants and inhabitants, it's all about risk mitigation, the longer we have to respond. It's all about emergency response and limiting how much section of the pipe is going to vent. And again, thank you, Commissioner Gehring, for pointing out thousands of feet of control valves or ML mainline block valves. These are the things that are going to be needed. But to put this pipeline east and north of Bismarck for all of if I would have been part of the siting team, just like I expressed my opinion when I got involved with Dakota Access Pipeline for a short stint, and they had their first route east and north of Bismarck, I basically told them they were insane to be doing that. This pipeline needs to run south of Bismarck, halfway between Northern Borders right-of-way and Dapples right-of-way in Bismarck, because you've got ample 20 miles to clear and disperse south, 20 miles for Bismarck, Mandan. But to run it where it's going right now, I would have used the same language. Are you insane? It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And that's all I can say. I'm about 3 miles away from it. I have friends that are hundreds of feet away, and this pipeline cannot be located where it is. It's an absolute injustice to Bismarck and its growth and all the citizens in the county. And 500 feet from a farmstead or anyone living, that's nuts.
So let's turn to another topic, and the issue of frost and frost heave. Summit indicates it plans to bury the pipeline 40 inches. 48 inches below. And you've been involved in pipelines, including siting them, including the depth, correct?
Of course.
Okay. And whether it's a natural gas pipeline, a methane gas line, an oil pipeline, they all have to deal with this frost heave issue, correct?
They all do, and one size doesn't fit all. So it's Commissioner Gehring gave all the things that I would give that affects frost heave.
Okay. And so then in terms of frost heave, they have indicated through their frost heave study that they looked at a 10-year time frame for the soil temperatures and frost. Is that a sufficient time period to determine the likelihood or possibility of frost heave occurring?
Well, I mean, this is going to be in service for decades. We've had frost go much deeper than that in Burley County. Even back with the records I got from the North Central River Forecast office out of Chanhassen, Minnesota, just 2 weeks ago. We've had stretches of weeks where the frost has stayed at 50 inches. Since 2009 or 10, we've been at 52 inches, 51 inches, 50 inches, 50 inches. And that's just going back to 2009. So, but again, if I'm sitting here testifying on behalf of Natural Gas Pipeline, I would just tell you that one size doesn't fit all. I mean, you have to bury deeper under a road. Under a railroad, I got to believe it's going to be significantly deeper bore to avoid the vibration. They're going 49 or 50 feet under the Missouri River, and I think the other crossings are 25 to 37 feet. So, I mean, all that's not unreasonable, but I think that whether you have drain tile in the field, whether you have a very rocky field where you have rocks that, are down quite a ways, I mean, you could get 6 foot, 7 foot frost. It would have to be pretty severe. The pipe does keep the soil warm around it. So, again, one size does not fit all. And that's where working with the landowners who have the most experience on their soil type and rocks and things like that could bother the pipeline if you get heaving going on.
In relation to some of the safety measures you talked about, is there such a thing as CO2 sensors?
Sure, just like H2S sensors, which they pretty much all wear out in western North Dakota.
Okay.
Yep.
And so, what are CO2 sensors, and would those be required in relation to this pipeline, and if so, where? Okay,
so in addition to distance from residents, ranch homes, farm homes, it's all a matter of how much time are you going to give people to respond. So if it's simply closing block valves and then you let the pipeline blow down, there has to be a quick response tied into the Department of Emergency Services where, and I've advocated for, and again, we haven't put these on natural gas pipelines, but somewhere, up and downstream wind, of this pipeline, that there's some CO2 monitoring, just like you have carbon monoxide monitors in your home. I hope you all do. But that there's some monitors out there that even if something isn't detected at the SCADA system in Ames, Iowa, that there's some, again, it's giving us as citizens a time to respond, and then we as citizens knowing what to do when the phone goes off, and I'm sure it'll say shelter in place, get indoors immediately, shut your windows, close your doors, shut any fresh air coming in from the outside. Those are the societal education points that are going to have to be made. This isn't just educating emergency response, law enforcement, fire, EMS, and all that. The citizens have to be educated on what to do.
And have you seen anything to suggest that Summit is proposing to have CO2 sensors placed in the community?
No.
Near this pipeline?
No.
And would those, in your opinion, be mandatory to alert the public in the event of a leak?
It's just an idea I had. Again, when you're talking only hundreds of feet, even several miles, just listen to what Chief Briggs had to say about the coverage. Now, that temperature, air temperature in Satarsha, Mississippi, isn't near as cold as it can get here. And that keeps that CO2 much more dense, much closer to the ground at 25 below zero. So we need something to give us as much early response as possible, no matter where this pipeline is located.
In regards to the frost heave study of Summit, you've reviewed that, is that correct?
I did.
Okay. And they used 5 monitoring sites over the 2,000-plus mile pipeline. Is that your understanding based on reviewing their report?
It is.
Okay. Is that sufficient to do a frost heave study for a 2,000-plus mile pipeline using 5 monitoring sites?
Well, I mean, there's 5 monitoring sites across 5 states seems a little light, but there's more than that when you're talking about, there's other resources and places, even localized where they might have some frost depth information. Again, as a responsible pipeline developer, you really need to have a really strong idea of what you're up against when you're dealing with the different soils, when you're crossing thousands of miles, because your soil changes, your water content changes, your water table changes, your snow cover changes, et cetera, all affecting frost depth. So it's incumbent upon them to be prudent and have a really good idea of the soil conditions and potential frost depth of every track they go through.
Judge, I'm going to just comment. Mr. Jundt, I thank you for pointing out Commissioner Goring's testimony. We all heard it. He was very clear on many things as far as mitigation, taking care of the land, topsoil, subsoil. I think we're repeating ourselves. I thank you for collaborating Mr. Goring's testimony, but we've heard it. So I'm going to ask that, Mr. Bakke, if you can ask questions that have not been addressed and answered, or if he is in contradiction, so we can move on.
And I just want to ask about some pipeline ductility issues. So have you studied the information in regards to whether or not there's any information showing whether the Summit pipeline pipe materials will meet specific ductility requirements?
I believe they will.
Okay. And is that important?
Extremely.
Okay, that's all the questions I have.
Mr. Wahlberg, are you questioning?
I'll try.
Okay.
I will try some ninja lawyering. I haven't heard it described that way. I'm going to try it here.
That just came to me. I apologize.
I couldn't tell if it was a compliment. I didn't think it was.
Well, I didn't mean it as an insult, so I guess if you were a ninja, that wouldn't be a bad thing, would it?
I don't look like one, but on this issue of frost heave, how many frost heave studies did you conduct in your work?
Again, project manager, we have engineers that did that work. So that was part and parcel to, we had our civil engineers that oversaw all that.
Part of the team.
You got it.
Okay. What depth is northern border buried at?
Typically, and this is a PHMSA thing, and what I've always said, building pipelines, I'm sure that's about 4 feet. It's a 42-inch pipe, probably 4 foot on average, but I'm sure there's places it's much deeper, like, under railroad crossings, things like that. But I'm guessing similar to what's happening here with this pipe.
Did you experience frost heave difficulties with the northern border pipeline?
Not that I'm aware of.
This idea of a monitoring system that you talked about, I think you said it's an idea to give people notice, right?
Early notice.
Early
warning.
And so if we think about the occasions where something like that would happen, I think what you're talking about there, it would have to be a very slow release, right? A very small release, because otherwise you've described this catastrophic explosion type event, and we don't need a monitor that tell us that, right?
Well, I think maybe I need to clarify that. This CO2 from a guillotine in a 24-inch, we have a 10, 20 mile an hour wind in 1 hour will be 20 miles. I'm talking. Well,
I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop you there, because before I have you answer a question like that or say things like that, how many plume modeling analyses have you done for carbon dioxide released from a pipeline in any environment at any time under any conditions?
Probably one less than Summit.
By my math,
I'm going to ask again the public to refrain for clapping and jeering. This just is not how these hearings are designed to run.
And it's entertaining, Mr. Jundt, but the answer is 0, right? The answer is 0, yes.
0 that I've conducted. I've only read several, and it's extremely complex.
A question, you described the source of the CO2 as having been burned off from natural gas in your testimony today. Do you recall that?
Yeah, I did.
You know where the CO2 is coming from that is being put into the Midwest Carbon Express pipeline?
I keep hearing it's off the fermentation process.
Is that burning of natural gas?
That's what creates a fermentation.
So when you say burning of the natural gas, you're equating that with the fermentation at the ethanol plants. I just wanted to...
Sir, that's why they burn natural gases, so that they can ferment the corn.
So your source of CO2 is the burning of the natural gas, not the fermentation itself.
Okay, so...
It's a question.
You're
Yes,
you're splitting hairs. The fermentation process is allowed because you're burning natural gas. They're taking the combustion gases off the stack that is a result of burning natural gas to heat the corn and cause fermentation. So it's from the burning of natural gas. The emissions from burning of natural gas.
It's the fermentation process that produces the CO2, yes?
No.
Okay.
It's the burning of this natural gas that is creating the heat to ferment corn, which is part of the fermentation process.
You talked about the potential for corrosion inside of the pipeline, and I think there what I heard you say was they just have to be very careful to make sure that they don't introduce too much water content into the pipe, right?
Dehydration will be even more critical than any natural gas line, correct?
Right, and you were just saying it's important to do that, not that it wasn't going to happen. I just wanted to make sure that you weren't...
Oh, I'm not accusing them of not doing it. I know that's going to be a very important aspect of operating this pipeline.
Got it. And so maybe that's one of the things we agree on, right? It's important for them to do what they say they're going to do.
Absolutely.
Right? And you'd agree that Mr. Powell, who has testified on behalf of the company, is a very capable person in charge of leading this project, right?
Yeah, judging by what I've read as his background.
Yeah, I mean, it's what you testified to at Burleigh County, right?
Yeah,
very capable individual.
Yeah, and has as much experience in CO2 pipelines as me. So...
Last one, and maybe this is, I apologize to everyone, but it's a curious question for me in the natural gas industry. You said natural gas pipelines are all odorized. Does that include all transmission pipelines?
No, sir.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. I thought I heard you saying that all natural gas lines were odorized, and that's not true.
It's, again, one size does not fit all. So if we've got a natural gas transmission line that's running 100 miles and not near any occupants to speak of, we probably won't be odorized at that point. But if we have a natural gas main line running through a populated area like we have one in Bismarck, they will odorize it.
And Mr. Jundt, all I was trying to understand, I thought I heard you to say all of them, and that just wasn't my experience with the laws and the rules.
Okay, all that are near citizens so that you have that early warning of odor.
I don't have anything further for Mr. Jundt. Thank you, Mr. Jundt.
Yep.
Mr. Pelham, any questions?
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon, Mr. Jundt. We heard Commissioner Goring talk about 1,000 feet, between 1,000 feet, placement of mainline valves in more populated urban areas. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I've been kind of chirping that for quite some time.
What's your opinion?
My opinion is I don't care where you put the block valves at this point around Bismarck. There's other issues, but yes, the closer, that's all mitigation again, Mr. Pellman. So 1,000 feet, you're going to vent 1,000 feet, not 9.5 miles, 15 miles, or 20 miles. It's all about mitigation. The further away, the less you vent. So yes, I would agree. That was a good point.
So then, as far as you had testified, and Mr. Bakke was asking you questions about the order of, shutting down the upstream valve could be shut, but the downstream valve would take some time in the order of it. Have you had experience with that in your job at WBI? I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely, I have. Being somebody on the safety committee, I was one of the first ones that found out about one of the last mainline incidences that happened in my time there. And it was on the way up to Saco, Montana in the summertime. The winds blow from the south-southeast. This crew was working south of Saco, Montana, replacing dresser-coupled pipeline. And I knew all these guys well because I helped, conduct training for them. So we had a track hoe, a backhoe, 2 big four-wheel drive Ford trucks all around. And of course, when you're excavating, pulling this pipe out, and we had both isolation valves shut. As they got close to the downstream isolation valve that had pressure up to it. This is a dresser-coupled pipeline that's held together with bolts from the 1920s, 30s. They pulled that section of pipe up close to the isolation valve, and the valve slid. Basically, the bolts were rusted out on the pressurized side. The valve slid, and she went kaboom. Due to our training, they knew to run upwind. You always know you have little wind socks or flags going. You always know which way the wind's going. But we had that pipeline shut down, and we do it in the summer because we pressure it up. There's enough pressure and load in there we can feed all the customers while we're doing pipeline replacement. They ran upstream. One guy, I think, weighed 375 pounds and was able to leap over a barbed wire fence. That was the joke at the conference meeting that spring, how Bill got over that 3-wire barbed wire fence without ripping his pants. Nobody was injured, and nothing would have happened had the backhoe operator shut the ignition off on the backhoe. But when you got 450 PSI whistling Dixie, it hurts your ears. So it eventually, the cloud ignited, and it just sat there, and it just flared until all the gas blew down. The next isolation valve was shut, and it just flared.
So
like
would that
that.
have been a manual closing of that, or would that have been automatic?
No, these automatically were closed. So they saw a pressure drop on the next downstream valve, and they shut that valve immediately. So they had to let another section of pipe blow down.
I see.
And they actually came back when it started to flare, and they came back and they stood around and waited till it blew down. There was no threat to Saco, Montana. There was no plume moving up there. They actually stood around it after it had fried all the equipment, burned it all, rubber tires and everything to a crisp.
Sir, I'm wondering if you have an opinion then on if is there a greater propensity for issues with the line being above ground, say 1,000 feet and in 1,000 feet increments with mainline valves, than if it remained underground with mainline valves at a greater distance, in your opinion?
Well, Mr. Pellman, that's a good point, because it's a catch-22, because valve settings, welds, compressor stations, dehydration facilities are where you are most susceptible to have a leak or an escape. So the more above-ground valve settings we have, there's going to be more maintenance required. They got to keep them painted nice and shiny like WBI does. You got to protect them from nefarious creatures, things like that. But again, I think the safety that it brings nearby residents far outweighs that added.
That was my question, because I recognize that there's sort of a catch-22, underground or increases. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, and I heard you say that your opinion is the greater, or the lesser different distances, rather, of mainline valves, in your opinion, would be a more prudent approach. Is that fair to say?
I would prefer, yes.
I'm just curious, the WBI pump station just north of Bismarck on 57th Avenue, are you familiar with that?
Been there many times.
Do you know when that was put in place?
Well, I want to say the first compressor engine in there, because it actually has a turbine, gas turbine engine running the compressor. They have one of those or two. I mean 30s.
Okay.
And that was way, way north of Bismarck.
I've
In the 30s.
been by there, and I've just wondered, well, how long has it been there? So the 1930s, you're saying?
Correct. And I was, part of the team that as Bismarck started to grow, we planted had those trees put around there. You can't hardly see it now. That's all noise mitigation. So.
Yep. Thank you, sir. I don't have any other questions. Victor has one or two.
So in that Montana incident you were talking about, how far was it to the next block valve?
Mr. Shook, I can't say for sure, but
Approximately is good enough.
I would say we had to blow down at least another 10 miles.
Miles? And how long did that flare of gas keep firing?
It was hours, because it's a declining flame.
Sure.
But the flame is, when it first ignited the cloud, that flame didn't turn into a flame to about 20 feet in the air. So it was just a jet until it mixed with the oxygen. And then probably it was hours, but they were able to come back and their equipment was all smoldering. It fried everything. Everything had melted tires. I saw all the equipment sitting in Glendive, Montana. It was quite the sight.
Sure. I'm just trying to get an idea for like the CO2
Hours.
block valve. So
Hours.
we're talking hours. So if
Hours.
a 24-inch line, 20-mile interval, 10-mile interval, I mean, obviously it's going to make a difference on intervals. Block valve.
We talking the CO2 line you're talking about? Yeah, mainline block valves. 20 miles is way too far. I know that's another thing on May 31st and June 1st. PHEMS is having their public hearing in Des Moines, Iowa. They're addressing all that. Fracture control, mainline block valve locations, and it all has to do with high consequence areas, distance from populated areas versus ranch, farm homes, things like that. But that's one of the things they're addressing is valve spacing, dispersion modeling, all those kinds of things.
I have read quite a bit up on those kind of things. I'm just trying to entertain some curiosity of how long we could expect if there's a full-bore guillotine break on a 24-inch line, in your opinion, how long would it blow gas for a 10-mile versus a 20-mile spacing of block valves?
I don't think it's linear, but it's probably going to be, it's not probably going to be twice as long, but it's probably going to be 1.8 or times as long, because that higher pressure is going to move that product out really fast and then it'll decline. But till it stops venting, that's when it reaches equilibrium with atmospheric pressure. And the same with the natural gas. So until that flame on that gas went down and it actually just snuffed itself out, it was actually at or below atmospheric pressure when it stopped. So, but I would say, look at what Chief Briggs said about, it vented for several hours, 9.5 miles. That was 1402 PSI when it ruptured. Now we're talking about 20 miles of potentially at some point, and I know that as a pipeline company, you want to get there sooner than later, fill your pipe. So 2183 PSI, we're talking substantially longer hours, and we're talking about CO2, 10, 20 mile an hour winds could cover a significant area in miles length and width.
Absolutely.
So at different concentrations, and 4% and higher is a problem. And we breathe 0.03 to 0.05, and OSHA says 8 hours you can be exposed to 0.5%. 0.5. So for many, many thousands of feet from a 24-inch guillotine rupture, we're going to be much higher probably than 4%.
Thank you for that. It's helpful. I have no further questions.
Mr. Leibel, any questions?
I have no questions.
Mr. Pranis?
Just briefly, Your Honor. My question, and I appreciate your testimony. So You, in your opinion, you believe it would be crazy to permit I think that was your word, to permit the pipeline on the proposed route. Is that correct?
East and north of Bismarck, absolutely. That's actually a longer route than if they would have just stayed more on the hypotenuse of their triangle and went south of Bismarck. And it's actually more pipe.
And your reasoning for that is that you believe that there would be substantial risk involved in, because of the proximity to populations in building that location. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
All right. So if the commission were to nonetheless decide to move forward and approve the pipeline along that route, then the next step would be to focus on mitigations, on all the precautions that could possibly be taken. Is that fair?
Yeah, the very next step would be I'm putting my house up for sale. So I'm about 3 miles away, and there will be, and you'll hear more about it in Burleigh County from others, but there will be, even before there's an incident anywhere in the 4 states, but there will be impediment to Bismarck's growth. There'll be land devaluation, and I spend a considerable amount of time outside with a golden retriever on my heel, spring, summer, fall, and 3 miles is nothing for this plume to move over. And, I could be 1,000 feet from my house and not be able to get back. So I don't want any part of it. So not to be knee-jerking, but yes, mitigation, no matter where it's at, mitigation will be key. Whether it's CO2 sensor tied to emergency response, you can work with DES. But you not only have to train emergency response, law enforcement, fire, EMS, you're going to have to train the citizens to know what to do.
If I can focus on just one specific aspect of risk mitigation, in your role for WBI, for MDU, were you involved in the selection of contractors to build pipeline projects?
I didn't make the final decision. There was a team. You go out for bids and things like that. So it was a selection team. So there were times when I was involved, yes. You were
involved in that. And what, for a project, given what you believe to be the risks, what kind of contractor, if this project moves forward, do you think should be selected to build the mainline section, in particular the section near Bismarck?
Well, that's a pretty easy question because that's the position I always took. Do you have any experience building a pipeline, excavating, building a pipeline in our state? Or I had to deal with Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota. So I always my input was always, I want folks that are familiar with the construction practices, the soils, the weather challenges are significant in this state. Nobody from Texas can imagine, you cannot imagine what it's like I can, to be out in southeast Montana in a raging snowstorm, clearing 4 feet of snow so we can lay a gathering line at 20 below zero weather. So if we're talking about bringing contractors up from Texas, I don't even think they own any woolly underwear, but they're going to need a whole lot more than that. So we want folks that are experienced, in my opinion, with dealing with the challenges of construction, soils, weather, et cetera, in North Dakota.
And to just take that a little further, would you want a contractor that had experience building large mainline pipeline similar to the kind of line that would be installed here in North Dakota or in comparable climate and soil conditions?
Well, I think that goes without saying. I don't think you'd hire someone that's only built little storage sheds to build your house. So, yeah, correct.
Thank you. That's all.
Commissioner Chrisman?
I think all mine have been asked and answered.
Commissioner Haugen-Hoffert?
Yes, I do. Mr. Jundt, thank you for your compassionate testimony so far. This morning I asked Mr. Paul about the valves, and safety valves, and he indicated that, recapped that they're 20 miles apart. However, he went on to say in high concentrated risk areas, they would evaluate it, putting them closer together. Do you remember that testimony?
I do.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you, what is your recommendation in those high concentrated risk areas, how far apart they should be?
I can't give you that answer. And because honestly, if you're wanting me to say something that justifies the route around Bismarck, there's so many other things involved in that than just spacing block valves closer. It runs right through planned developments and right through housing developments. And I mean, if you've watched Bismarck grow in the last 10 years, it's on a fast pace to continue north and northeast. And there's so many other factors involved. One of the most significant reasons we have pipeline incidences in the U.S. of any kind are third-party strikes. And when you route this pipeline in the future growth and development of Bismarck north and east, you just increase the risk. So risk mitigation, that's a huge one. So block valve spacing, we just had that discussion here. So if you're trying to get me on record to say...
just for clarification. Okay. I am not identifying a certain area. Yeah. I am not. Mr. Paul said high concentrated risk areas. I don't know what they are. I'm just using the general term.
Right.
And in your testimony, you've given recommendations. I'm just asking you, based on your experience,
well,
how far apart...
I'm going to go with what he said. I don't have experience in designing and building a pure CO2 pipeline. When we space those, and I don't mean to be non-pervasive, Commissioner Haugenhofer, I'm just trying to tell you that the more time you give residents and emergency responders to respond before there's catastrophic concentrations, the less you're able to vent. It's kind of common sense. The less you have to vent, the less size of the plume. So, I don't know, 1,000 feet would vent fairly quickly and be a lot smaller plume off a 24-inch pipeline. So, I don't know what the optimal answer is.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. I have no further questions.
Mr. Dawson?
Judge Hogan, how can you detect carbon dioxide? Is the detector like your carbon monoxide detector? Does it just measure the lack of oxygen, or does it measure actually carbon dioxide?
I don't know. I've never had a reason, Mr. Dawson, to get one, but they do exist. I mean, just like carbon monoxide detectors, which I have all over my house.
But they aren't at Lowe's.
They may be eventually. Not currently.
No further questions.
Any redirect, Mr. Bakke?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Jundt.
I want to thank the commissioners and Commissioner Haugenhofer. I've watched I was at the 14-hour painstaking March 14th. I've listened to Gwinner and Wahpeton, and I want to thank you for being the one commissioner that has asked about health and safety, because that's what everybody behind me and in Burleigh County, that is what we're most concerned with. We all know that this pipeline is coming to us because of politics, and Commissioner Gehring did a good job addressing that. I'm going to shake his hand sometime. I know his dad, Charlie. So I'm 100% subscribed to that. It's basically something that we didn't ask for, that we're having to deal with. And what we can do and what you can do for us in your job is make sure that the health and safety, aside from noxious weeds and all those rudimentary things, whether you're putting in a regional water or rural water pipe, are addressed. I think first and foremost is the health and safety. If this thing ruptures north of Bismarck, that CO2 is going to move in low-lying areas, and what's the lowest lying area in Bismarck is going to get most of it? What is that? That's the Missouri River. Those people are significantly at risk, because if it ruptures north of Bismarck, it's going to go around Burnt Creek and it's going to head right over to the river. And it's going to be fairly high concentration. So the plume models are going to show that. So that again is all the research and the reading I've done on plume modeling, which gets into calculus equations and assumptions galore. So that's that's the one thing I wanted to say to public hearing. So I thank you for humoring me.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Jundt.
Thank you.